In the early years of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at the height of its global power. From India to Africa, from the Mediterranean to the Far East, Britain controlled the seas and commanded vast territories. Yet beneath this appearance of absolute dominance lay a growing fear, a fear not of armies, but of energy. As the world entered the industrial age, coal was no longer enough. Oil was becoming the fuel of the future, and Britain was dangerously behind. By 1914, this fear would quietly pull Britain toward a distant land known then as Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Officially, Britain's military presence there was framed as a defensive necessity during the First World War. Unofficially, it marked the beginning of a long struggle over oil, influence, and empire that would reshape the Middle East for the next century. To understand why British troops landed in Iraq in 1914, we must first understand how oil transformed global power. For most of the 19th century, Britain's industrial and military supremacy was powered by coal. Coal fueled factories, railways, and, most importantly, the Royal Navy. British ships could refuel at coaling stations scattered across the empire, giving Britain unmatched maritime reach, but by the early 1900s, coal was becoming a strategic liability. It was bulky, slow to load, and limited the speed and range of warships. Oil, by contrast, burned cleaner, generated more power, and allowed ships to travel faster and farther with fewer stops. In 1912, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, the Royal Navy made a revolutionary decision: it would begin converting from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ones. Militarily, the decision was sound. Strategically, it was terrifying. Britain had coal. Britain did not have oil. At the dawn of the First World War, the world's major oil producers were the United States and the Russian Empire. Britain, despite its vast empire, controlled almost no oil of its own. This meant that the British Navy, the backbone of imperial power, would soon rely on foreign energy supplies. Churchill understood the risk clearly. In his own words, safety and certainty in oil lie in variety and variety alone. Britain needed secure, politically controlled oil sources, not foreign suppliers that could be cut off in wartime. This urgency led Britain to the Middle East. At the time, Iraq did not exist as a nation-state. The region was part of the Ottoman Empire, ruled from Istanbul. Mesopotamia was a peripheral province, poor, underdeveloped, and largely ignored by the Ottoman central government, but geologists had begun to notice something unusual. Surface oil seepages had been observed near Mosul and along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for centuries. What once seemed like a geological curiosity now looked like strategic treasure. European powers, especially Britain and Germany, were paying attention. Germany's growing influence in the Ottoman Empire, symbolized by the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, deeply alarmed British policymakers. A German-Ottoman alliance with access to Middle Eastern oil could threaten British dominance from the Mediterranean to India. Mesopotamia was no longer irrelevant. It was becoming essential. Britain's first major step toward energy security came not in Iraq, but in neighboring Persia, modern Iran. In 1908, oil was discovered there, leading to the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In 1914, just months before the outbreak of World War I, the British government purchased a controlling stake in the company. This was not a normal business decision. It was a strategic act of state. For the first time, the British government directly owned oil assets, yet Persian oil alone was not enough. Britain wanted redundancy, security, and expansion. Mesopotamia, just across the border, became the next logical target. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire soon after. Publicly, Britain framed its actions as defensive, protecting India, safeguarding trade routes, and countering Ottoman aggression. Privately, British officials saw something else: opportunity. In November 1914, British forces landed at Basra, a port city at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Officially, the goal was to protect oil facilities in Persia and secure maritime routes. In reality, this was the opening move in the occupation of Mesopotamia. Basra was not just a port. It was a gateway. Unlike the Western Front, there were no massive headlines announcing Britain's invasion of Mesopotamia. No dramatic declarations. No public debate about oil, yet British military planners understood exactly what was at stake. Control Basra, and Britain could secure supply lines. Push north, and Britain could influence, or control, the oil-rich lands of Iraq before rivals did. The invasion unfolded with little resistance at first. Ottoman forces were poorly equipped and stretched thin. What began as a protective operation soon became a full-scale campaign. Britain was no longer just defending the empire, it was reshaping the Middle East. By the end of 1914, British boots were firmly planted in Mesopotamian soil. What followed would be years of brutal fighting, political maneuvering, and secret agreements that carved the region into artificial states. Oil did not cause the First World War, but oil shaped how Britain fought it, and in the next part, we will explore how Britain's campaign in Iraq expanded far beyond its original objectives, how early military failures revealed the cost of imperial ambition, and how oil quietly transformed from a strategic asset into the foundation of British rule in the region. When British troops landed at Basra in late 1914, the mission appeared limited. Secure the port. Protect nearby oil facilities in Persia. Defend imperial trade routes. But wars rarely remain limited, and empires rarely stop once they advance. Within months, Britain's presence in Mesopotamia expanded far beyond its original justification. What began as protection quietly transformed into possession, and the cost would be far higher than London expected. British commanders quickly realized that holding Basra alone left them exposed. Ottoman forces still controlled the vast interior, including the strategic cities along the Tigris River. Any serious threat to British supply lines could come from upriver. The solution, British planners believed, was simple: push north. By mid-1915, British Indian Army units advanced along the Tigris toward Baghdad. The logic was partly military, partly political, and partly economic. Baghdad carried immense symbolic value, and control of central Mesopotamia would secure Britain's long-term influence over the region, including its untapped oil potential. But the British underestimated both the terrain and their enemy. Mesopotamia was nothing like the battlefields of Europe. British soldiers faced extreme heat, flooding rivers, disease, and supply shortages. Equipment designed for European warfare failed in the desert. Troops suffered from cholera, dysentery, and exhaustion. Riverboats struggled against strong currents. Roads barely existed. Ottoman forces, though often poorly supplied, had one major advantage: familiarity. The deeper Britain pushed inland, the more fragile its position became. By late 1915, British forces reached the town of Kut al-Amara, a strategic bend in the Tigris River. Confident from earlier successes, British commanders chose to hold the town rather than retreat. It was a catastrophic decision. Ottoman troops surrounded Kut in December 1915, cutting off British supply lines. What followed was one of the most humiliating episodes in British military history. For 5 months, British and Indian troops endured starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. Relief attempts failed repeatedly. Supplies ran out. Horses were eaten. Morale collapsed. In April 1916, the British commander surrendered. Over 13,000 soldiers were taken prisoner by Ottoman forces. Many would die during forced marches or in captivity. The defeat shocked Britain and shattered the myth of effortless imperial dominance. Yet even in defeat, Britain did not withdraw. Instead, London doubled down. The loss at Kut forced British leaders to confront a painful question: why continue fighting in Mesopotamia at all? The official answer remained strategic defense, protecting India, countering Ottoman threats, maintaining wartime momentum. But behind closed doors, another factor dominated discussions: oil. By 1916, oil had proven itself indispensable. Warships, trucks, aircraft, and mechanized warfare all depended on it. Britain could not afford to abandon a region increasingly understood as energy-rich. Mesopotamia was no longer just a battlefield, it was a future asset. After Kut, Britain reorganized its entire Mesopotamian operation. New commanders were appointed. Supply systems were overhauled. Medical infrastructure improved. Railways, ports, and depots were constructed at unprecedented speed. This was no longer an improvised campaign, it was a long-term project. By late 1916, British forces resumed their advance north, slower, better supplied, and far more determined. In March 1917, British troops entered Baghdad. This time, there was no siege, no desperate retreat. The Ottomans withdrew, unwilling to defend the city at great cost. The capture of Baghdad was presented to the British public as redemption for Kut, proof that the empire had recovered its strength, but strategically, it meant something far greater. Britain now controlled the heart of Mesopotamia. Although large-scale oil extraction in Iraq would come later, British officials already understood the region's potential. Geological surveys intensified. Political structures were quietly planned. Military occupation blurred into civil administration. By the final years of the war, Britain was no longer merely fighting the Ottomans, it was preparing to rule. This transition marked a critical shift. Oil was no longer just a wartime concern. It was becoming the foundation of Britain's post-war strategy in the Middle East. For local populations, British victory brought uncertainty rather than stability. Traditional Ottoman systems collapsed. New authorities imposed unfamiliar rules. Promises of autonomy circulated, often contradicting secret agreements made between European powers. Arab leaders who had supported Britain against the Ottomans soon realized that independence was not the empire's priority, control was. By the end of World War I, Britain's presence in Iraq was firmly established. What had begun as a protective maneuver had evolved into occupation. Oil, once a strategic necessity, now justified long-term influence. This pattern, intervention framed as security, followed by control driven by resources, would repeat itself across the region for decades, and Iraq would remain at its center. In the next part, we will explore what happened after the war ended, how secret treaties reshaped borders, how Iraq was created as a modern state, and how oil transformed from a strategic asset into a source of permanent instability, because the real legacy of Britain's oil war did not end in 1918, it was only beginning. When the guns of the First World War fell silent in 1918, Mesopotamia lay shattered. Ottoman rule had collapsed. British troops occupied the land. And the future of the region was no longer being decided in Baghdad or Basra, but in European capitals thousands of miles away. What followed was not peace, but planning, and oil sat quietly at the center of it all. While soldiers fought and died in the Middle East, diplomats had already begun carving up the Ottoman Empire in secret. In 1916, Britain and France negotiated an agreement that divided Ottoman territories into zones of influence. Long before the war had ended, these borders were not drawn along ethnic, tribal, or religious lines. They were drawn according to imperial convenience. Mesopotamia, rich in strategic position and suspected oil reserves, fell firmly within Britain's sphere. The people living there were never consulted. Before the war, Mesopotamia consisted of 3 Ottoman provinces, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. Each had different populations, identities, and political traditions. After the war, Britain fused them into a single new entity. That entity would become Iraq. The decision was not based on unity or stability. It was based on control. Mosul, in particular, was crucial. Geological surveys increasingly suggested that the region contained vast oil reserves. Losing Mosul to another power, especially France, was unacceptable to Britain. Oil turned borders into battlegrounds. In 1920, the newly formed League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Mesopotamia. Officially, Britain was to prepare the territory for self-rule. In practice, the mandate legalized occupation. British officials controlled finance, foreign policy, and, most importantly, natural resources. This arrangement allowed Britain to rule without calling it colonialism, but on the ground, Iraqis understood the reality. Resistance erupted almost immediately. In the summer of 1920, tribal groups, religious leaders, and former Ottoman officers launched a widespread revolt against British rule. The uprising spread rapidly across central and southern Iraq. Britain responded with overwhelming force. Villages were bombed. Collective punishments imposed. Thousands were killed. To suppress the rebellion, Britain relied heavily on air power, one of the earliest examples of aerial control used against civilian populations. The message was clear: independence would not come easily. Oil infrastructure, meanwhile, remained protected. After the revolt, Britain adjusted its strategy. Direct rule was expensive and politically risky. Instead, Britain would govern indirectly. In 1921, Britain installed a monarchy under King Faisal, a ruler seen as cooperative with British interests. Iraq became a kingdom in name, but not in sovereignty. British advisors remained embedded throughout the government. Military bases stayed. Oil concessions were untouched. This system gave Iraq a flag and an anthem, but not control over its future. The heart of Britain's long-term strategy was the Turkish Petroleum Company. Despite its name, the company was dominated by British interests, with smaller French and later American stakes. Its purpose was simple: secure exclusive rights to explore and extract oil in Iraq. In 1927, oil was struck near Kirkuk. The discovery confirmed what Britain had suspected all along: Mesopotamia was one of the world's great oil regions. From that moment on, Iraq's fate was sealed. Although oil was extracted from Iraqi land, Iraqis had little say in how it was used or how profits were distributed. Revenues flowed outward, to London, Paris, and eventually Washington. Infrastructure was built for export, not development. Pipelines ran to the Mediterranean. Local needs came second. This imbalance planted deep resentment. Oil, once framed as a promise of modernization, became a symbol of exploitation. The borders Britain created grouped together communities with long histories of rivalry and little shared political experience. Governance depended on coercion rather than consensus. Stability was maintained not through unity, but through force. This fragility was not accidental. A divided Iraq was easier to manage, and less able to challenge foreign control over oil. The modern Iraqi state was born under pressure, shaped by outside interests, and constrained from the start. By the late 1920s, Britain had achieved what it set out to do. It secured strategic oil supplies, safeguarded imperial routes, and established a friendly regime, but the cost was immense. Political legitimacy was weak. Social divisions deepened. And oil, instead of empowering the nation, became a source of conflict that would draw foreign powers back again and again. The invasion of 1914 no longer looked like a wartime necessity. It looked like the opening chapter of a much longer story. In the final part, we will examine how Britain's oil-driven legacy shaped Iraq's later coups, foreign interventions, and wars, and why the patterns established a century ago still echo in the region today. Because history does not disappear, it repeats. By the time Britain formally ended its mandate in Iraq in 1932, the empire declared its mission complete. Iraq was now an independent state, with its own government, flag, and international recognition, but independence on paper did not mean independence in reality. The political, economic, and military systems Britain had constructed were designed around one central priority: oil. And those systems would shape Iraq's fate for the next 100 years. The Iraqi monarchy survived by balancing internal divisions while relying heavily on foreign support. British advisors continued to shape policy. British military bases remained. Oil concessions were left untouched. For many Iraqis, the state felt artificial, distant from the people it governed and more accountable to foreign interests than to its own citizens. This resentment simmered for decades. Oil revenues increased, but benefits were uneven. Wealth concentrated among elites. Political participation remained limited. Dissent was often suppressed in the name of stability. Stability, however, proved fragile. In July 1958, Iraqi military officers overthrew the monarchy in a violent coup. The royal family was killed. British influence collapsed overnight. The revolution was not just anti-monarchy, it was anti-imperial. For the first time since 1914, Iraq attempted to reclaim full control over its political and economic future, including its oil, but the timing was dangerous. The world had changed. By the mid-20th century, oil was no longer just a strategic resource, it was the backbone of the global economy. The Middle East became a central arena in the Cold War rivalry between East and West. Iraq, rich in oil and newly assertive, found itself under intense pressure. Western powers feared nationalization. Soviet influence loomed. Regional alliances shifted constantly. Oil ensured that Iraq would never be ignored, but also never left alone. In the 1970s, Iraq took decisive steps to nationalize its oil industry, ending decades of foreign dominance. For many Iraqis, this was a moment of pride, a delayed fulfillment of sovereignty denied since the First World War. Oil revenues surged. Infrastructure expanded. Education and healthcare improved. But oil wealth also strengthened authoritarian rule. The state grew powerful. Dissent became dangerous. Military spending increased. And Iraq's leadership believed oil could insulate the country from consequences. That belief would prove catastrophic. From the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s to the Gulf War in 1991, Iraq became trapped in cycles of conflict. Oil fields were bombed. Infrastructure destroyed. Sanctions crippled the economy. Each war further weakened the state while keeping Iraq at the center of global attention. Oil, once again, was never far from the calculations. Control of energy routes. Stability of supply. Regional dominance. The same logic that drew Britain to Basra in 1914 continued to shape decisions generations later. Foreign interventions were repeatedly justified as security measures. Protection of global interests. Defense against threats, but each intervention reinforced the same structural problems: weakened sovereignty, fragmented politics, and external dependency. The foundations laid during Britain's original occupation, artificial borders, centralized control, resource-driven governance, proved remarkably resilient. History did not move forward. It looped. Today, Iraq possesses some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Oil funds the state. Oil sustains the economy. Oil defines Iraq's global importance, yet oil has also distorted development, fueled corruption, and attracted constant foreign involvement. The contradiction remains unresolved. Oil is Iraq's greatest strength, and its deepest vulnerability. When British troops landed in Basra more than a century ago, oil was not mentioned in public speeches or newspaper headlines. But it shaped every major decision that followed. Oil influenced where Britain fought. Oil influenced how borders were drawn. Oil influenced who ruled, and who did not. The invasion of Iraq in 1914 was not an isolated wartime act. It was the opening move in a long struggle over energy, power, and control that continues to this day. Britain did not invade Iraq solely for oil, but without oil, Britain would likely never have stayed. That distinction matters, because it explains why Iraq's modern history cannot be separated from global energy politics, and why the consequences of imperial decisions still shape lives far beyond the battlefield. Empires fade, but their choices endure. To understand Iraq today, we must look back, not just to recent wars, but to the moment when oil transformed from a curiosity into a currency of power. That moment came in 1914, and the world has been living with its consequences ever since.